Sir, if you'll approach this railing in front of me and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
All right, sir, if you'll come on around here and have a seat in the witness stand, make yourself comfortable. You may adjust that microphone.
This should work.
All right. Sir, please state your name.
Raul S. Banasco, R-A-U-L-S-B-A-N-A-S-C-O.
And how are you employed?
I am a prison consultant as well as a jail administrator.
And can you please give a brief summary of where you've worked in the past?
Started my career in the state of New York with juvenile justice system, and in 1988 joined the Florida State Department of Corrections as a corrections officer, in which I served that agency for 20 years in a variety of capacities. I was a classification officer, moved up the ranks as a classification supervisor, worked a variety of facilities, starting at Lake Correctional Institution, Maximum Security Prison, Central Florida Reception Center, and then got promoted to Polk CI as a senior supervisor and served the next 7 years as an assistant warden down south at Martin CI, Tomoka Correctional Institution outside of Daytona Beach, and then got promoted to Hernando CI as a warden and served in the capacity as director of staff development for the whole prison system for about 2 years, and then transitioned over to Orlando's County Jail and Osceola County Jail as well.
All right. And do you have any certifications?
Yes, I'm a certified jail administrator through the AJA Commission, as well as a certified corrections executive through ACA.
And what's your education?
My education background, my undergraduate degree is in psychology, as well as my master's in public administration through Florida Atlantic University.
And I heard your employment summary, but when was the last time you worked for the Florida Department of Corrections?
2006.
And from the time that you worked at the Florida Department of Corrections, are you familiar with the department's policies and procedures?
Yes.
Okay. And you said that you also worked in the county jail, Orange County and Osceola County?
Correct.
All right. Are you familiar with the policy and procedures with both the jails and the prisons in Florida?
Yes.
And have you been working as a consultant and an expert witness?
Yes.
How much do you charge?
$200 an hour.
Okay. And have you previously testified in court proceedings?
Yes.
How many times?
Over 27 times.
Okay. And have you previously testified as an expert?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time we'd offer Raul Banasco as an expert in corrections policy. And
No objection. All right, you may ask any questions.
how did you first get involved in Aiden's case?
Yeah, I was contacted on March 7th, 2023 by yourself, Rosemary Peoples.
All right. And in the Florida Department of Corrections, how are juveniles held or housed?
The way juveniles are held, depending on how they're classified, juveniles can be sentenced up to the age of 21 by the courts as a youthful offender, or the department can classify them or categorize them up to the age of 24, in which they will go through the reception process, either Central Florida Reception Center in this case, and they will be sent to a prison based on their custody and their risk assessment and their behavior while in the county jail, as well as when they enter into the prison system.
All right. Now, do inmates have to work in prison?
I'm sorry.
Do inmates have to work in prison?
Yes, they do.
And does that include inmates that are sentenced to a term of years or life?
Yes, both.
Okay. What if they're disabled? Do they still have to work?
They still have to work.
And what happens if they refuse to work?
They will be put in confinement, as we often call it, the hole. If they fail to work, they will be given a rule infraction, which is known as disciplinary report. They will go through their administrative process and spend the sanction of their time in disciplinary confinement with no privileges, just the basic day-to-day living environment that we're providing to them.
All right. Now, how much of the work inside the prison is actually done by the inmates?
Approximately 80 to 85% of the prison system is sustained by the inmate labor that we housed.
And are inmates that are, what incentives are there for inmates that have a term of years versus a life sentence?
Well, for the most part, they're both the same. The incentives are you can have commissary opportunities, visitations with your family and friends, phone calls, and recreation. All those things are just incentives, but at the end of the day, if you're not working, all those privileges will be taken away from you.
All right. So then, if someone's in prison and they're not following the rules, what would happen?
They will spend as much time in disciplinary confinement, and if they continue to behave in that fashion, the next level will be either send them to a facility known as close management, where we send the most egregious inmates who cannot function in the general population or can do harm to themselves, other inmates, or the staff. So we will place them in close management, and we have designated prisons throughout the state that would deal with that population.
What's a disciplinary referral?
A disciplinary referral is pretty much a rule infraction. The Department of Corrections has a variety of rule infractions, either from a minor disciplinary report to a major, and each of those carry an infraction of either loss of gain time or placement in disciplinary confinement for an extended period of time.
And it sounds like then there's different levels of disciplinary reports?
Correct. There's minor disciplinary reports. For example, a minor disciplinary report might be disobeying a verbal order or written order or tattooing, which might give you privileges taken away or even maybe put you on probation, while anyone who assaults an officer, assaults an inmate, or basically has any kind of physical activity or might be a danger to the population can be placed in disciplinary confinement. That's a major disciplinary report.
Then are the disciplinary reports, are they handled differently with a county jail versus prison?
Well, county jails have a sort of different process. County jails, for the most part, because they're short-term type of inmates for the most part, they have their own disciplinary processes, but they pretty much mirror themselves. They have identified certain charges that are minor, as well as those major disciplinary reports that are for major rule infractions. So they have a different system, but it sort of mirrors itself.
Now, looking at, again, turning to prisons, Florida Department of Corrections, what programs are available to juveniles or younger offenders?
Well, it depends. When they come to the reception process, one of the things we have to do is look at them at their sentence structure, look at their release date, if they're serving a life sentence, also their medical grade, mental health grade, and then we do an assessment and we determine what is the prison that will best fit this individual, and more important, keeping public safety paramount. And in this particular case, with the Department of Corrections, there's only 2 facilities at this time due to closures that can house an individual like this, and that is either Suwannee Correctional Institution, where we send all the maximum security male youthful offenders, or Lake City Correctional Institution, which is another facility we contract with. I say we, the Department of Corrections contracts with, that we send the 2 type of male youthful offenders. The women go to Lowell CI, where they have about 5,000 women housed at that facility.
So it sounds like the youthful or the juveniles under 21 then are sent to Lake City or the other place you just mentioned.
In both climates are different. So for the most part, those who are following the rules and don't have a lot of behavior issues will most likely end up at Suwannee Correctional Institution. We send more of the most challenging population of youth over to Lake City Correctional Institution, where they deal with more of the behavior and aggressive behavior that comes with youthful offenders.
And you said why is there more aggressive behavior with youthful offenders?
In my years of experience running a youthful offender camp, what you see is individuals who are between the age of 13, I've seen them come into the prison system, to the age of 24, which they still haven't developed a lot of their social skills. And also there's a lot of territorial, I say turfs, in which they have to prove themselves. So they tend to be very aggressive or have to do give the perception that they're strong, and they get into a lot of behavioral challenges, which they find themselves fighting a lot and getting themselves in a lot of trouble, in which that population is very challenging to manage as an administrator.
Now, in terms of, I was asking about programs earlier. Has there been a change over the years in the programs available to the youth in the Department of Corrections?
Yes, most recently they have this new program called CNUS, which is now an integrated risk assessment program that they just rolled out, which happens at the reception center. So to paint the picture, there's 3 reception centers in the state of Florida: South Florida, North Florida, and Central Florida for males, in which at the reception center now we have technology, we have tablets, in which the inmates have to answer a variety of questionnaires. That is all tabulated, and it is assessed in this new component of risk assessment and determine what will meet their risk assessment, because the goal is to deal from community to prison. So these are individuals that they're trying to identify so we can give them the resources the agency can. So hopefully when they get released, they don't get reoffended and come back into the system. The challenge that the current system has, like most historically also, is that those inmates who are sentenced to death or life sentence or have a severe mental health issue are excluded from this new risk assessment program. That's something that will be considered much later down the road, because they're trying to capture the population that has at least 36 months from release, to capture that population, to provide them with services in the efforts of hopefully them not reoffending.
All right, so with a life sentence, there's some programs may be available. Is it fair to describe that a juvenile with a life sentence would be a bottom of the priority list to access these programs?
Yes, youthful offenders will never be denied program opportunities, but they were not on the priority list. They're not on the spectrum. The goal is to eventually give them an opportunity, but looking at the population that's going to be released in hopes that they will benefit more effectively with the programs offered.
In prison, what's the typical day for an inmate?
Typical day for an individual in prison, basically at 4:30 in the morning, you're waked up, you're woken up, you have to go to count. Then we march you down to the chow hall. You have up to 10 minutes in which you have to eat your meal. You don't get the opportunity to sit next to your friend. The goal is get in, get out. You go back to your housing unit. You go through another count. You go through various counts throughout the 24-hour cycle. You get back to your dormitory, and then you have either your work assignment or your program assignment in which you have to be where you need to be. If you have any kind of medical appointments, you have to follow those as well. And basically throughout the entire day, it's regimented. You're told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and the expectation that you follow the rules of the Department of Corrections.
Judge, at this time, I'm going to pose an objection. I'm not sure what relevance the day-to-day life that someone might have in prison is relevant to the sentencing factors in this particular case.
Thank you, Your Honor. Then, in terms of looking specifically to this case, you received some materials that you were able to review?
Yes, I did.
All right. And in review of those materials from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, what information were you able to glean from that?
What I was able to receive from the Jacksonville was several informational sheets, incident reports of his involvement in an altercation or a group situation with other inmates, as well as his confinement records, where he was either in general population or in isolation for self-harm or for protection as well.
All right. And in terms of his confinement in Duval, there's that incident report. What was the resolution for that?
On one of the reports on December 25th, he checked himself in because he was in fear of his life, because he stated in his statement that he was being harassed or bullied over his commissary. Coincidentally, that same day, from December 25th to January 25th, Sergeant Cox was assigned to investigate a variety of allegations made by other inmates in his housing environment he was at the time, I think, 15, and the other inmates were 17, and basically there was some concerning behavior that the officer had observed, that he had made some threats to another inmate, as well as there were some other hearsay conversations, but at the end, was not clear on what came out of that circumstance. Just basically, the incident report was provided to me, and that was the only information I was provided by the Jacksonville County Sheriff's Office.
All right. Then, looking to what you had said earlier about that juvenile population having behavioral issues, was that uncommon what you read in that report, seeing that other juveniles were fighting with each other, having behavioral issues with each other?
Dealing with this population is not uncommon. They are going to get into a variety of fights and steal from each other. That's just the juvenile behavior that happens, and that's sort of what we deal with in the corrections environment. And I think in also referencing Sergeant Cox, I know in his deposition, he is familiar with that as well. It sort of happens in county jails as well as prisons. That's just a very challenging population.
Now, did you speak with any of Aiden's family members?
Yes, I did.
Who was that?
His mother, Crystal Smith.
And what did you learn in that conversation?
In the short period of time I spoke with her, what I learned was that he was in 8th grade at the time of the crime that was committed, and that he had some sort of learning challenge in which she provided tutoring lessons after class, and that he was raised in a Christian faith-backed family.
Were you able to speak to anyone from the Jacksonville or the Duval jail?
No, ma'am. I made an attempt to speak to Chief Calloway, who's the jail administrator for Duval County. He was on vacation, and as recent as yesterday, he reached out to me, and I reached out to him, but we never had an opportunity to communicate and talk.
So Aiden's been in custody since May 9th, and he's moved around a bit, meaning there was a short period where he was in Volusia, and the majority of time, is it fair to say he's been in Duval?
Correct.
All right. How long has he been in custody overall?
He's been in custody over 22 months. He came into St. John's on May 9th, and on May 10th, he was a direct file in which they moved him over to the juvenile detention Volusia Regional Facility over in Daytona Beach for about 18 days. And then on May 28th, he was transferred over to Duval County, Jacksonville County Sheriff's Office.
Right. And in his time, you mentioned it earlier, but so he's been in protective custody, or if you can explain the difference?
Of the 22 months he's been in Duval, pretty much he's been in some form of self-harm or protective custody for about 17 months. He's only remained in different stints of time, 5 months in general population.
And is it common for a juvenile that's direct filed with adult charges for that child to be in this form of protective custody?
Case by case. Sometimes what you do have is some of the younger population that, depending on the size, maybe their lack of exposure to the criminal justice system, they will utilize the opportunity to go into self-harm or might have a mental health crisis, or even for protection from other circumstances, that they will utilize that as an option to get out of their circumstances. So it does happen from time to time, but it's case by case.
Okay. Now, in terms of Aiden's family, were they able to discuss their ability to contact him or financially support him?
Yes, his mother shared with me. She communicates with him weekly, as well as she provides as much as she can to his commissary account, so he has some way to sustain himself for items that he wants to purchase.
Right. Does Aiden have a work history?
No, he was 14 at the time of his arrest, and from my records, he was not employed or had that opportunity due to his age.
So what special skills does he have, if any?
He has none.
In terms of, because you did do some classification work in your years in DOC or
Approximately
Department
about
of
7 years, yes, ma'am.
All right. With what you know of the charge or what he's pending sentencing on, how would he be classified, meaning Aiden?
He will be classified as close custody given the due to the crime that was committed, as well as most likely his sentence. But because of the crime, he would be close custody throughout the Department of Corrections.
And based on your experience then, how would a term of years versus a life sentence change Aiden's classification, if any?
The difference would be a term of years would give him an opportunity for a judge to review his sentence at a later date, and also give him perhaps the opportunity to get, I could say, placed on a priority list or a little higher level to be considered for some kind of vocational programming or cognitive development courses, anger management, those things that might be suitable based on his risk assessment outcome.
So the programs that are there, he would have some priority if he had a term of years versus a life sentence?
Given the Department of Corrections challenges, if those who have a lesser sentence or have an opportunity to be reviewed at a later date will most likely be moved up on the list.
All right. And then, but the classification wouldn't change if it's a life sentence or a term of years?
Absolutely not. He will remain close custody based on my years of experience.
All right. Now, Aiden can read, so what opportunities would he have, for example, a GED program?
That would be something that the Department of Corrections Education Department would have to do based on the risk assessment, have him go through a TAP test and look at the opportunity when his role would come and if they had a slot for him to be enrolled in the GED program, given the circumstances of only 2 prisons at this time designated for youthful offenders, which is where the department is challenged with a big population and very few prisons to house them.
All right. At what point With a term of years then, because the minimum that Aiden would be eligible for is 40, at what point would he be moved, or would he be moved after the age of 25?
Well, he's subject to be moved at any time. It depends on his institutional adjustment. So regardless of what prison he gets sent to, he can turn 18, and if he's not functioning well in a youthful offender camp or we can send him to an adult prison throughout the state of Florida.
All right. And is it fair to describe then that based on your experience, well, let me ask, based on your experience, what would you anticipate placement then specific for Aiden?
Most likely, he would probably be placed at Suwannee Correctional Institution, which, based on his age, he's a lot younger than those that they send over the Lake City Correctional Institution, but most likely, he would be sent to Suwannee Correctional Institution to see how he does in adjustment at that facility.
All right. And I understand your answer earlier, but just to clarify, so in either instance, whether it's a term of years of life, he would be eligible for programs. Is that fair?
Yes, he would.
But with a life sentence, then the priority or his access to those programs would be diminished.
Correct.
Fair to say that with a life sentence, he'd be at the bottom of any list because the priority would be for the individuals or the juveniles with 36 months or less.
Yes.
And it wasn't always like that, is that fair to say, because the resources have now been reduced?
Yeah, a lot has changed in the last few years, particularly with COVID, but I left the system in 2006, and years ago, there was a lot of opportunity for rehabilitative programs. At the end of the day, resources were different. The economy was in a different place, and we all in the corrections profession, not only just in prison systems, but in county jails, a lot of our educational cognitive development courses are sort of not as available because the resources not out there, and the employment and the workforce is a challenge to get those folks in. That's why we're doing all type of interesting things with technology, with tablets, trying to provide as many program services as possible in a corrections environment.
All right. And based on your experience, do you believe that Aiden can contribute to the prison system if he was sentenced to a term of years instead of a life sentence?
Well, if he's sentenced to a term of years, the opportunity to get involved in some kind of vocational program would benefit the Department of Corrections, so he can learn some kind of trade and put that trade to work to benefit the taxpayers of the state of Florida by putting him to help maintain the facilities that we have to maintain throughout the state.
Okay. No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Good morning, Mr. Banasco.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
You do almost all of your work as a private consultant is criminal, correct?
Correct.
90% of your work is in the criminal realm.
Correct.
80% of that work that you've done is for the defense, is that right?
Yes.
And in fact, you've never been retained as an expert in your field by any state agency in the state of Florida, correct?
No.
And you said you were contacted about this case on March the 7th, which is like 12 days ago,
Yes.
2 weeks ago. And in that time, you have reviewed records to come to court today and to testify about what you think is best for the defendant, in this case, Aiden Fucci, is that right?
Based on my years of experience on the information, yes.
Have you ever met with Aiden Fucci?
No.
Why not?
Never had the opportunity because of the time constraints and because where he was placed, my understanding, in Duval County, it was very restrictive in having access to him.
You live here in the state of Florida, correct?
Yes, sir.
You said that, did anybody at the Duval County Jail tell you that you could not meet with Mr. Fucci?
No, sir.
Did anybody else tell you that you would not be permitted to speak with Mr. Fucci?
No, sir.
So why didn't you meet with Mr. Fucci?
When I spoke to the Public Defender's Office, the time constraints were very tight, and actually reaching out to Chief Galloway, those were one of the things I know I was hoping to maybe get an opportunity to speak with him in person, but it just never came to fruition.
You were contacted 2 weeks ago, and you don't think that you had enough time to meet with Mr. Fucci within that 2 weeks?
In talking with the public defender's office and where he was housed, it was my understanding that would have been a challenge at the time.
I see. So the public defender's office told you that you could not meet with Mr. Fucci.
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
They did not give you the opportunity to meet with him, correct?
Yes.
Would you have liked to have met with him?
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
Overruled.
If the opportunity was afforded to me, yes.
And why is that?
It's always a good opportunity. If the opportunity is provided, it's always good to have a good conversation to know face to face where that individual is, based just having a report on records.
Now, you mentioned, you discussed some altercations that Mr. Fucci had gotten into, some records that you reviewed on that, is that right?
Yes.
And to kind of start off this conversation, you'd indicated that, I think you were pointing out that he has basically been sort of in a confinement status at the Duval County Jail for all but, I think you said 5 days, is that right?
No, he's been in general population approximately 5 months.
Okay.
And 17 have been, as they categorize it, isolation cell, either for mental health or for self-harm or for protection.
Okay. And I wanted to talk about that. You had indicated that he was in that confinement situation because of, I guess, some indications of self-harm. Did you read in any of the records where Mr. Fucci actually committed acts of self-harm at all?
No.
Did you review, did you see any medical records where he had injured himself in any way?
No.
Isn't it true, Mr. Banasco, that sometimes that those records, when they say self-harm, he may be placed in that status as a precautionary measure?
Yes.
Is there any indication whatsoever that it was anything more than simply precautionary?
In some instances, this often happens because of the notoriety of the case. They place them in that status as well. And I think in one of the documents it was sort of referenced because someone might have heard about his case. It was in the news or something.
Isn't it also correct that someone can be placed in confinement status for disciplinary reasons?
Yes.
And in fact, in one of the stretches where he was in confinement, the date that he was placed in confinement coincided with a report where he had threatened another inmate.
Correct. He had checked himself in on December 25th, and that's when Sergeant Cox reports referenced December 25th to January 25th, the period of time in which there was a...
Let's talk a little bit about that. What was the date that he had self-reported
December 25th, 21.
of 2021, is that correct?
Yes.
And you had kind of indicated that was the same date that the report had issued that he had threatened someone, right?
Yes, the report that was written by Sergeant Cox covers the period of December 25th, of 2021 to January 25th of 2021, in which he completed on the January 27th of 2021.
Isn't it true, sir, that that report was dated January the 25th of 2022?
The signature is the 22, correct.
Okay,
But
so-
on the front of the report, it started December 25th, 21, to January 25th, 22.
The report, though, indicates that the threat occurred on January the 25th of 2022. That's when it was reported, correct?
That's when it was reported,
Right. That's a year.
later.
That's a year later, right? So those two things don't necessarily coincide.
Well, I would bear to differ. The incident that he checked himself in was December 25th, 21, according to the report.
Right.
And the report by Sergeant Cox covers a span of December 25th, 21 to January 25th, 2022.
I understand what you're trying to say, but you're trying to convey that he was placed in confinement because he was in fear of his life. And
The
you're trying to
records-
coincide that event with this other incident that occurred where he threatened an inmate, right?
No, what I'm trying to state is he checked himself in on the 21st, December 25th of 2021, and in the synopsis report that covers December 25th, 21 to January 25th, 22, in the report from Sergeant Cox, it makes reference to a variety of allegations from other inmates, as well as an officer observing some behavior by him. So it sort of butt ups against the report. He checks himself in, and when they reviewed that period of time, it backs up into the date he checked himself in for self-harm.
But my original question, though, was one of the stretches that he spent in confinement, the date of that, the beginning of his confinement period, coincided with the date that it was reported that he had threatened another inmate.
That's correct.
And he threatened another inmate by saying he was going to stab him, correct?
That's what's stated in the report. Yes, sir.
Now, you had indicated earlier that it was not clear how that sort of investigation turned out.
Correct. I was requesting hopefully additional more information to find out what resulted from that.
So you didn't review any disciplinary reports.
I was not furnished that information, sir.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your testimony concerning some of the things you said about the difference between a term of years sentence versus a life sentence. You had indicated that it was your understanding that it was only under a term of years sentence that Mr. Fucci would receive some type of review. Did I understand you correctly?
No, because they're youthful offenders, they are going to get a period of review where the judge can look at possibly modifying their sentence.
Okay. So you understand that whether he gets a term of years sentence or whether he gets a life sentence, he's going to still have a review.
Correct.
And so for juveniles, a person who's been sentenced to a crime that committed while he was a juvenile, there's, regardless of what the sentence is going to be, there's a possibility he could get out one day.
That's correct.
And the Department of Corrections understands this.
That's correct.
And so there are programs that would be available to him. Is that right?
Programs are always going to be available. It's just a priority.
One moment, Your Honor. Nothing further.
Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Banasco.
Good morning.
2 weeks ago, basically, when I'd sent you the paperwork available, I'd indicated these are the DRs that I'm aware of. And on review, you explained to me that they were not DRs.
That's correct.
And that's when we started the ball rolling, so to speak, to see if you could speak to Captain Calloway in Jacksonville Sheriff's Office.
Chief Calloway, yes.
Chief Calloway, I apologize. So on your review again of what I presume was a DR, what was the result of that incident?
It was very unclear. Basically, there were some allegations made. The officer did witness the individual, Fucci, make a threat against another inmate, and there was an extensive assessment of several inmates and witnesses of complaints, as well as his statement as well.
All right.
That's all I could gather from the information.
And then looking to the population, because they're all juveniles there, and they're all juveniles with serious charges in Jacksonville. Is that fair to say?
Fair to say, there's most youthful offenders who are in that environment usually have some very, very heinous crimes they were committed. Yes, ma'am.
All right. And is it uncommon, or let me backstep it a bit, is it uncommon for different groups to form within jails?
No.
Okay. And if an individual enters a jail and doesn't have any association with any of those groups, is his time in jail more difficult?
Most likely, with my years of experience, they have to identify with a group, or they will be often preyed on, unless depending on their demeanor and their response to certain kind of jailhouse or prison house environment. They either survive, flight, or fight.
All right. So part of the behavior issues that come out with juveniles, is that born out of this issue of they need to defend themselves against the other juveniles that are there?
Well, in my years of experience, and particularly with juveniles in the adult prison system, that is their defense mechanism for the most part, unless they're individuals who know people in prison or have gang affiliations. But unless they're not really connected, they sort of have to find their way, navigate their environment, and sort of attach themselves with somebody in order to most likely not be part of the overall management challenges that administrators have to deal with.
And for the juvenile that has no one to attach to, solitary would be a safe place. Is that fair?
It's common that they would check themselves in for their own safety or a variety of other reasons, but that is usually the go-to to sort of check out of your housing environment.
All right. And that's similar to what we see with Aiden Fucci in the county jail records?
From my records, he has spent the majority of his time in protective custody or some form of isolation, which he has not really functioned much in general population, so that is correct.
No further questions, Your Honor.
I have ask a few more questions. Mr. Banasco, I want to ask you about the confinement situation. Did you ever go to the Duval County Jail to see kind of what the setup was?
No, sir.
Did you ever review the deposition of Officer Cox?
Sergeant Cox, yes, sir.
You did review his deposition. So you saw that in his deposition, he indicated that the juveniles that are placed in confinement are not there by themselves. They're actually there with other juveniles.
Sometimes at 2 or 3, I read that.
So he's not there in isolation completely alone.
No, but for the most part, not in general population, but it's their form of isolation as they classify it.
I think in one circumstance, he indicated there was, could be as many as 10 juveniles in that area, correct?
I did read that as well.
Nothing further.
All right. Excused. All right. One more follow-up.
Just one more follow-up, Your Honor. You have the inmate housing location records?
I'm sorry, say that again.
The inmate housing location records?
Yes, I do.
All right. So there are instances where he has another bunkie, so to speak, for a short period of time, but it's still fair to describe him as in isolation or housed alone for the majority of the time?
Let me make reference to that again. There was some instances where I remember where sometimes he had one bunkie, sometimes he had no bunkie, sometimes he had 2 or 3 in his room.
Okay. No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, Ms. Wicks, be excused.
Yes, sir.